TA. Good looking out. Um, Understand the literary structure of the Pentateuch. Again, looking the broad overview, very broad strokes, and then as we go throughout the semester, we'll be filling in some of the blanks, and then we'll be introducing Genesis the second half of class. It is my goal to have us go from the start of pre-Genesis history all the way through to Genesis 6. So Lord, help us and be with us, bless us, as may his face shine upon us and be gracious to us. So a short history of Israel. So this is post-Exodus after Deuteronomy. So right around 1250 to 1200, you have the Israelites having been liberated from the hand of the Egyptians. This will be the second generation. What they're going to do, they're going to go into the land of Canaan, which again, modern day Israel, and destroy towns and the probable invasion of Israelites into Canaan. And as we know, as you know from reading Joshua, and you'll know this from Biblit, we don't think that this was necessarily a totalitarian effort, in as much as the Hebrews or the Israelites left a lot of people behind. And so what the Hebrew tribes begin to do right around 12 to 1100 BC is they begin to settle down in Canaan. They begin to settle down. And after that, they begin to establish the monarchy with Saul as the first king of Israel. And if you just track with me for a few minutes, I will bring up why this is an important point to bring up. So the establishment, once after Saul, the setting up of the monarchy in conjunction with the prophet Samuel, you have David, who rises to be Israel's greatest king. He captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and thus begins the rise of Israel's greatness. After David, we have Solomon, who's the king of Israel. And Solomon, well known, best known, not just for his wisdom, but also building the first temple in Jerusalem. Building the temple in Jerusalem. So thus we have God finally being present with the people in a land. And again, those of you that have taken Biblit, you will know well, that's what God's original intention is, God being present with his people in a land. Until you go down a few years and being in the land, having God's presence there, it starts to get a little complicated. Israel starts dabbling in idolatry with foreign nations. And then you start having, especially starting with Solomon, you have the establishment of treaties with foreign nations, usually by intermarrying amongst the different rulers. So Solomon would do, he would take a daughter from a foreign nation, intermarry, and that would be the means of providing peace between nations. And eventually Israel slides down into idolatry to the point where there's just no hope left for them, despite continual calls by the prophets to turn back. Thus, Israel is sent into exile. This is Israel, the northern kingdom, sent into exile by the Assyrians, 722, 721. And then you have King Sennacherib of Assyria, who tries to attack Jerusalem, but fails to do so. You then have the exile, or the post-exilic period, where Judah finds themselves in similar circumstances as Israel, again with idolatry, creating pacts and allegiances with foreign nations in order to secure their political welfare, except for the fact that this ends up getting them in trouble. So about 587, 586 BCE, Jerusalem will be overtaken by the Babylonians. And then eventually, after the fall of Babylon, Cyrus of Persia will then send the Jews back home. And again, this was a move intended by the Persians in order to kind of satisfy the colonized, in order to help them be a more peaceful people. Because if your people are happy, they're not going to be as apt to rebel against you, especially when you start imposing taxes and whatnot. Because at least you're home. We'll charge you money, but at least you're at home amongst your people. And this marks the Second Temple period, Second Temple Judaism. The reason why I bring a lot of this up is because it's specifically here at the 516, right around here. That's when a lot of this material, scholars say, gets compiled together. And so it makes quite a bit of difference, again, to have not just these stories be passed down in verbal form, as we talked about last week, that this is an oral culture, that they're storytelling people, but to also recognize that during this time of post-exile, to recognize and to be reminded about a God who is able to deliver from the hands of oppressors after having just suffered in exile. About how God's desire to be present with this people through this telling, this retelling of what God has done to bring this people, this chosen people, back to himself. That what that then does to spur on the faithfulness of the people, both in terms of their understanding of God and their understanding of themselves. That they don't understand themselves outside of what God has done as creator and as liberator in creating the heavens and the earth, and that he has no other rival or no other force that's what's working opposite him. And then the stories in Genesis about how the follies of idolatry and self-control and autonomy, and how those things often lead people astray. And how the stories of God choosing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then seeing the plight of those who were oppressed down in Egypt, and how God had worked on their behalf to provide liberation and establish them as his chosen people. You can see what that might do to your identity as God's people post all the turmoil, the tragedy, the trauma having been experienced by people who were driven out of their land, having family members killed, and now being placed back home. And so again, that's why I bring up this history, in order to remind us of where they've been, because as they're reading these texts, again, that it's important for us to recognize not only the people that's being written to, but also what's happening around the people in the context in which they're reading. And so again, it's like reading. I don't know if you guys keep letters from exes, ex-girlfriends, ex-boyfriends. It reads much different when you were in the throes of love, of what you thought was love, and then you read it again a year, 2, 3 later, if you still kept that thing around, because of the changes in which you've made, that you're not necessarily the same person. Or if you've written a letter to yourself, let me make it less heartbreaking as Valentine's Day is approaching. If you wrote yourself a letter, like elementary school, you ever write yourself a letter like, hey, you got to send this to yourself like in 5 years, and your elementary school teacher sends it back to you? Anybody ever do that? No? Okay, so some of you, it's a mixed bag. Or if you've written a letter, even if it's just like a month later or a year later, or you write yourself a letter at the beginning of the new year, you open it up at the end of the year. That the times in which you read a certain text, especially if it's loaded with meaning, the context plays a much of part of how you read as much as it is the content within it. That context and content will oftentimes flavor readings of the text, and the Bible is not immune from that. And so again, if a lot of it is being read from this position, we start to read it a little bit differently.
Question,
so as a reading, go ahead, Jasper.
So pretty much you're saying like, think about all the stuff that they went through, and like just like the ups and downs and everything, and then try placing yourself in that kind of a situation, and then like really trying to feel how, they're feeling at this point. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So when I bring up stuff, and I will bring up stuff today in Genesis, to read it from this point of view, that even just, again, thinking of these kinds of things, when we talk about primordial history, and you guys had read for Theomachy how in different stories in the ancient Near East, that there's wars amongst the gods. At first, that there's multiple deities, which that's the first like obvious difference between the stories in Genesis and the stories of the ancient Near East. That there's nobody creating God, there's no war going on, there's no procreative activities that God participates in. And so, again, having just come out of exile, when they are in a pagan land, when they're in areas where there are the presence or thought to be presence of multiple deities, you start to see, when you have stories of God having no comparison, no other comparative deity, what that would then do, and not only about the statement they're saying about God, but also what kind of people are they? And especially when you start having this God, the same one who creates is the one who liberates and calls his people to himself, that the God who created all the stuff out here is the same one that we belong to and is bringing us into his household. And to make those kinds of connections, especially after exile, something like exile. But again, and it's not to say that this is when they're being written. It's possible, but I'm saying this is when they could be compiled, all put together. That as oral tradition is being passed down since way back over here, that once it starts getting put down into book form, that context also matters as well. Of why did it start getting written down over here? And so yeah, so it's both to affirm your thoughts about to take into account their history, then also both the history and what's the theological message that's being sent in light of the history. But excellent thought. Excellent thought. And so, as you guys know, both from your readings and if you've taken cultures or are in cultures, you'll know that the Bible isn't the only story with that's talking about beginnings. You have the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, Egyptians, who also have creation stories. But again, there are some marked differences between the stories that are prevalent in the other empires. And so this is known history within the ancient Near East, but again, you have it demythologized. And what I mean by demythologized is that it lacks the elements that are common for ancient Near Eastern myths, including the use of magic, the role of sex in procreation as creative properties in order to create, lack of violence, I believe I said that, multiple deities. And so we'll continue to demythologize some of it. But again, that what Genesis is pointing out is critique against ancient Near Eastern commonly understood assumptions. And we'll talk about a little bit of that today. So Genesis 12 through 50, what we call the patriarchal narratives. And these are the narratives about Israel's ancestors or fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their households. And you notice we make mention specifically of the males in large part because that's how the story tracks them. But we very well can include the women in there as well because they have just as much a part to play. And we'll talk about that when we get there, and the role that women play within the narratives. So Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel and Leah. And these stories are going to be told in a way that mirrors some of the themes that come up in Genesis 1 through 11, but are going to be told in light of what happens in Israel's history. But what I mean by that is that what what will be told about God in Genesis 1 through 11 will come up again in the patriarchal narrative. So when I say God, when we talk about God as creator, we can't just think in terms of birds, in terms of cows, in terms of sheep, in terms of dirt. We also have to think of life, that God creates life. And that's what he's going to continue to do with Abraham, Isaac, and again with Jacob. Because as some of you know from these stories, that there will be a major issue specifically with Abraham and Isaac, and it'll present itself a little bit with Jacob and Rebecca, but most of it having to do with barrenness. And that God's intervention will mean the presence of a newborn baby, new life. And so again, God creating life when there is a barrenness, and I'll connect the two between barrenness and Genesis 1. I'll talk about it when we get there. So Exodus. And so just a heads up, we are going over the literary structure at this point, which is why we're kind of bouncing around a little bit. What we have here are the rescue narratives that you have of God responding to the cries of the people who are being oppressed in Egypt. You have Exodus 1 through 19, which is the actual rescue narrative. And then in 16 through 19, more specifically, that those wilderness narratives of divine provision. It should be 1 through 15. It's going to bug me because typos bug me a lot. There you go. And so again, some of these aren't clean lines. There will be some that bleed into one another, but these are broad strokes for us to see an overarching view of where we're going this semester and to kind of be able to see what is the main point of the stories that are being brought up. And the reason why I bring up rescue stories, and we'll talk about redemption in the context of Exodus, we get around to it a little bit in Biblia, but we're going to dive more in depth into it, because there's going to be layers that are brought on through the narrative that are common for Hebrew culture that we need to talk about, especially when we talk about redemption and salvation. Because the way the Old Testament will frame salvation is different than how we commonly understand it today in terms of getting to go to heaven. That salvation in the Old Testament is often looking like rescue, more so than it is, again, getting a ticket to heaven. So, again, we'll talk about that when we get to Exodus. So in Exodus 20 through 40, you have that Sinai covenant and law code. You have God, after having rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians, he's going to then create a covenant with the people of Israel, and they're going to then agree to it. And so the Sinai code, like Sinai covenant, creates a kind of contract, a legal contract between the two. Just kind of you have the, so to speak, that you have the bride and the groom there saying their vows and saying their I do's. But very quickly they're going to get off the rails. But that bit between 25 to 30, that's more law code here in Exodus. So it really does. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and get up out of here. There we go. Really goes all the way up to about 30. Well, 23. 30. Of covenant and law code. And we'll talk about this because already on the honeymoon, things start going sour in Exodus 32. Within the same few chapters, you're going to have things start to go south. But then right after that, God will then establish what is called the tabernacle, him being present with his people in a tent. God being present with his people in a tent. And Leviticus. What Leviticus will do will help Israel, this new people that have been delivered from the hand of the Egyptians, that have known only a life of oppression and slavery, that have been free, that have been freshly liberated. It helps them to order their worship in such a way where they don't have to just make it up and hope and guess that they get it right. That part of the grace being extended by Yahweh towards the Israelites is in giving them directions like these. And imagine having to be in a relationship where you're constantly having to guess expectations. And this isn't just romantic. Business relationships, school relationships, friendships, where you're constantly having to guess. And the kind of stress and strain that that puts on the relationship, even with, again, parental relationships. That some of you and some of you know very well what are the expectations from your family, and that causes you even more stress than not knowing maybe what they expect. But that it's difficult to navigate a relationship without knowing the expectations. But graciously, God gives Leviticus in order for the people to know and what are these expectations, not only within their worship, but helping them and teaching them and guiding them in order to help them to know in what ways ought they to rightly worship. And I brought this up last week, but it's also a mark of grace that the invasiveness of a book like Leviticus, and that that God doesn't just care about what they do, but also cares about them personally. And that what do they do? Again, everything from menstruation to boils to blisters to oozes, and again, it just all kinds of physical ailments. That God doesn't just care about what the people do, but He cares about who they are and what happens to them personally. Especially in a time where medicine isn't readily available, you can't just go on WebMD in order for WebMD to tell you that you're about to die in 15 minutes, no matter if you just smash your toe against the wall. They don't have any of those luxuries, and so the grace that is being demonstrated again by God towards people that don't have to just figure it out for themselves. He doesn't leave them to their own devices. And so there's a helpful quote here for us that the narratives, then chapters 8 through 10, 16, and 24 allude to one another and serve as structural indicators for the developing thought of the legal sections. These deal consecutively with sacrifices, cleanness, holiness, and redemption. So we don't just have to read through legal code, but then we also read narratives that are actively applying what the legal codes are trying to get at. And so there's a few more here, and then we'll pause to ask some questions. You have Numbers, which is a journey in the wilderness. You have this book that's usually chopped up into 3 parts. You have the Numbers 1 through about 11 verses into chapter 10, wilderness in Sinai. The Numbers 10, 11 through 22, from Sinai to Kadesh, and at Numbers 22, 2 to 36, 13, the steps of Moab. And it's going to be important to note, even within seeing the blocks like this, that where the most important activity happens is here. When we get to Numbers, you will notice that most of the important activity happens here, especially when the first generation start kind of parting their own ways. And we'll see what happens to the first generation here. And what is it that got them into trouble? And especially helpful here, especially if you've been or if you are at a church that talks about no complaining. You can't complain or else you're not going to get your blessing. God's not going to get you into the promised land. You're going to forfeit some kind of something, whatever it might be. And it's oftentimes taken from these narratives in Numbers. The problem is that when you read through Psalms, you have a lot of complaining. So what is the difference between the complaining happening in Numbers and the complaining happening in Psalms, to where one is encouraged and the other one is judged to the point where they are condemned to death? And how do we keep ourselves in one camp and away from another? And so we'll talk about that when we get here to Numbers. And so you have a literary structure here. Again, this is what we call a chiasm. Chiasm, chiasm. And what this is that it helps us to organize literature in such a way to help us recognize patterns. So you see here at 1, and then 1 prime down here, God numbers Israel. God numbers Israel, 2, and then 2 prime, plagues break out. 3, God defends Moses, 3 prime. God defends Israel from Balaam's curse. So again, you'll see here. 4, spies see the land. 4, Israel defeats the Canaanites. How's it having to do with land? 5, Korah leads a rebellion. Miriam dies, Moses rebels against God, and then 6 here, Aaron must bear the guilt and the red heifer ashes to cleanse the people of the sanctuary, not enough. What a chiasm will help us to see is what's the most important part of a piece of literature and where is it all leading towards, and what are some of the implications thereafter. And so you can see where is it trying to lead towards. Aaron's sons must bear the guilt, and the red heifer ashes to cleanse the people, sanctuary not enough. Again, this is a point we'll talk about when we get to Numbers, that as the people are on a journey with God, this will become a turning point in God's relationship with his people. This will become a turning point in God's relationship with his people, specifically in the Pentateuch. That'll have ramifications later on. So in Deuteronomy, you have Deuteronomy that's going to be set up as a series of 3 speeches made by Moses. As you guys know from, again, from having taken cultures, or you will take cultures, of looking through ancient Near Eastern treaties. And we'll talk about some of the elements here when we get to 10 Commandments. But again, so much of what Israel is adopting is pulled from the cultures that they are a part of in order to help to communicate a relationship and establish a relationship between God and people. And so you see the prologue there. We'll introduce the parties. You have the essence of the laws. And this is where you have language like, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that you will have that, oh, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And that's where you will have the kind of charge given to Israel in order to pledge their loyalty and allegiance to God and God alone. You also have the core laws there. Again, the bulk, the guts, the material of what they ought to do. The curses and blessings. And again, we'll talk about it when we get there, because again, this gets misconstrued as well. But that curses and blessings at the heart is an incentive towards faithfulness. This isn't just a blanket threat that God is trying to either, he's on the hunt either to smash them to a pulp, or kind of just let them continue to carry on. No, but rather, again, these are incentives towards faithfulness, specifically in keeping these, not just keeping these laws, but in participating as God's covenant people, being faithful to the relationship that they said yes to. And that's going to be especially important. I'm going to bring that up when we get to Exodus especially. You have renewal of the covenant here, 29 to 32, and then the epilogue where our boy Moses dies. And so before we get into introducing Genesis, do we have any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions thus far? Anything that has stood out to you specifically, and just kind of in going over again in broad strokes about what we've talked about thus far, or anything that you're looking forward to? Man, all right. All right. Well, again, if you do have any questions, please do interrupt, jump in, because there will be a bit of content we're going to be getting through here, especially as we open up Genesis. So, all right. So let's go ahead and jump into Genesis, having already taken our broad strokes. Let's go ahead and start taking a look. Let me share this with you guys. Take a look. There you go. So again, with Genesis, that it's the stories are compiled from oral tradition passed down over centuries. That again, that the Hebrews are an oral culture. You'll have something called an oral Torah, and that's the teachings that are passed on by word of mouth. teachings that are passed on by word of mouth. Or as Ludacris says, word of mouth. With an F on the end. And so you have, and I brought this up before, again, to kind of rehash it, that you have these traditions that are being written down later in Israel's history that partner with oral tradition. It doesn't just abolish it.
Professor,
Yes.
there's also a thing where since they lived up to like 900 years old and stuff like that, a lot of those people like Adam and whatnot, Noah or pre-Noah, I guess the oral tradition then, it was like a lot more accurate because obviously they're living like hundreds of years old, and then a lot of them were still alive even when, you know, like you get kind of what I'm saying, like.
Yeah, but the only issue is right around Noah's time, human life gets kind of abbreviated to 120 years. And it happens in Genesis 6. But even then, with being 120 years old, that the possibility for retaining accuracy is still relevant, because it's not just a bunch of teenagers telling each other stories. You have older people that pass on stories to the younger ones while the older people are still alive. And so you have this tradition that's happening. And again, they're not living in a culture. For us, it's hard to remember why we walk to the fridge 5 minutes from now. We forget what we went to our room to do. We forget where our wallets and our phones went. But again, that these stories that are of the utmost importance, that the pace of life, which moves a lot slower, and with the weight that is being carried, again, for the events that are most important to you, that you're going to remember that. You remember that, whether it be for the best or for the worst, both in terms of really great events and really, really god-awful events that you never wished happened. And so again, anybody who spent any significant time with your grandparents, they'll let you. I remember growing up with my grandpa and my grandma. Man, I must have heard the story. She used to tell a story every single time about how me and my brother would play soccer in the backyard. And we thought that backyard was huge. It was probably like maybe like 15 by 8 backyard. It was, realizing now it was tiny, but we thought it was massive back then. But every single time we sat down to eat, ¿recuerdas cuando? And she would just start telling the story over and over and over again. And again, I can tell you right now off the top of my head, I know exactly what she would say. And we rehearse those things. And I'm sure I'm going to do the same thing with my kids. Telling them over and over and over again that same old story. Remember this? Remember? And so again, that the significant events that happen, we carry with us. And the Hebrews enact a lot of the same things. And so we have here in Genesis, in broad strokes, and we already talked about this, between the primeval history and the ancestral history, that we'll get into some specifics, that what you have in Genesis 1 through 11 is this creation and then violence which ensues after chapter 3 as a result of what happens in chapter 3. Then you have recreation and through the flood and the multitude of humanity that then starts spreading out throughout the earth, which again sets up the context for what's happening here in chapter 12. Then you have Abram and Abraham. I come up here in the first few 14 chapters, and you have Isaac. My friend's grandma kept forgetting my name, but every time I would see her, she always called me Isaac. I don't know why. But she would call me Isaac. And then Esau and Jacob, Israel. So if you hear me randomly yell Isaac, that's why, because I'm probably going to yell Isaac at the top of my lungs. So just so you guys are in on the joke. So Genesis 1 through 11. What is Genesis 1 through 11 trying to communicate to us What was it trying to communicate to early readers and now to us? What it's trying to do is provide a lens for us to read the rest of Genesis, specifically 12 through 50, that what will get established in these first few chapters will get built on, will get extended thematically, will get teased out as we see the God who creates start to create life with cats like Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac, Rebecca. Start to create life, and again to continue along the path of working with these human beings that we first saw within the first few chapters of Genesis, and how messy it is, how messy of a project it is. Because again, you would think that in a book that was trying to establish God's supremacy over all things and how he's perfectly in control over all things, that the book would not get off to such a messy start. And it's not, again, it's not to say that God isn't supreme over all things. It's just that the reality of the mess is that doesn't nullify God's power or strength, rather how God continuously, patiently, and graciously work with creation towards his ends and demonstrates power through that and not just through coercive force. And I'll tease out some of that as we get through moving through Genesis, especially with Abraham, and how God is always the instigator for grace. How it's God's grace that instigates all these movements of new life for individuals. So in Genesis 1 through 11, Yahweh has supremacy from the beginning. And again, it's going to be assumed from Genesis 1 through 11, starting at verse 1, in chapter 1, that it's just God. That he's at the beginning, uncreated, yet undermines all human structures. And we're going to see that with the temple at Babel, which again, as we talked about theomachy, that's another episode of theomachy, where you have these humans in solidarity with one another attempting to go and to essentially be like God once again. So God has to go down there and confuse their language. So Genesis 1 and 2, and we'll get into more specifics, but again, these are broad views, broad strokes. Genesis 1 and 2 is part of a larger narrative found in Genesis 1 to 11. And again, that they serve as a dual introduction. And this is going to be important for us to remember when we come back from break, this kind of dual introduction about what and who are we being introduced to, both in terms of material creation and the story of humanity's creation. And I would dare to say that it also is telling us a story about who God is, as the Bible always does. The Bible has a way of doing that really well. And again, we'll jump into that after break here in a few minutes. And you have the adoption. Let me go back if you guys are still writing that. I don't know. All right. And so I had brought this up last week, but to bring it up again, and we'll refer back to this when we start talking about Genesis 1 and 2, that when we start talking about what and how God creates, this is the assumption about what's happening. That the God who creates will work with these pieces, and what we see him begin to do is to start to order these parts and pieces in such a way where then it will begin to take the shape of what will be God's temple. But the parts that you have here are the waters, again, above the firmament or above the sky here. You have the floodgates here, which again, as you're reading through Noah, you'll see some of that language where the floodgates open up and water just starts kind of pouring down. You have the stars and the moon and the sun that just hanging out up here. You have these kind of columns in the mountains. You have the earth here. You have Sheol, the place of the dead within the earth. Then you have waters here that are, as you guys will know, waters that are representative of chaos. And then you have columns that hold up the earth. Columns that hold up the earth. And so again, this is an early view of the Bible, and the Bible's not trying to put forth a scientific assertion as much as this is what the assumption is. And that above all this will be the heavenly seat of the divinity or the God. And so we'll start teasing out some of the implications for all this and why I bring it up. But again, it's important for us to know within our early context that this is what they're working with, and how God will begin to order these pieces and these parts and start to put them together in a way that the Hebrews understand. And so again, that with creation understood in the ancient Near East, that you have those the three levels. You have sky, earth, and then waters underneath. Or put simply, above the earth, and below the earth. This kind of early understanding about the way the earth is formed and created is reflected in the text as we read through Genesis 1, that you have God who starts with a kind of formless space. And oftentimes we've been taught or told that it means that there was nothing there. There was, that God created what we might say ex nihilo, or out of nothing. But what would be more aptly put is that God creates order out of chaos. God creates order out of chaos. So it'd be probably more akin to taking a bunch of Legos, dumping them out of the box, and then building from there. That there are no pre-ordered pieces or sets of parts that are there, and it's not that you just kind of whip together some magic in order to make these things come to life, but that rather, again, God is giving order to these pieces that are now there, because again, you have at the beginning the Spirit that is hovering over the waters. So how can there be nothing of those waters? And so again, but what God begins to do is to start to order these pieces in order to create a home, a habitat for himself to be with humanity. And when we come back from break, you guys will start seeing how God works his way from out here and then begins specifically in Genesis 1. He works his way over here and then kind of move towards the center. And the possibility that maybe the humans aren't necessarily the pinnacle of all creation, that there's something else going on within Genesis 1. And especially Genesis 2, there's definitely something else going on in what Genesis 2 sees as the kind of the pinnacle. What's the main event in Genesis 2? Because it's going to be a little different than what's happening in Genesis 1. Do you have any questions? Any questions? Again, a lot of this is introductory. There will be probably a lot more pushback and questions on this on the other half of break, but I did want to ask you guys up front, are there any questions thus far? No? Either I did an okay job of explaining it, or we're still out of it to ask questions. Did anybody have a question?
I kind
Go ahead,
of
Estella.
I'm having, I don't know, I'm just gonna say this way, I'm kind of having trouble understanding why it's important for us to look at the stories from the ancient Near East.
Well, Go ahead. Finish your question. Sorry.
No, it's kind of like, because it's kind of for me like, my question is kind of like, why are they important? Why is it important that we compare those stories to the story of the Bible and creation and all that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really, really good question. It's important for us to know the context in which these stories come out of. That it's really important for us to know history, not just to compare and say what they're just like everybody else, because the Bible sometimes will get that charge, but to see in what ways are these stories different and what do those differences make and how the Bible is trying to tell its own story about who God is. Because there is some significant differences. And when we talk about Genesis 1 and 2, I'll refer to some of those differences, but that's a big reason why. That this is one story among quite a few stories, but it's the differences within those stories that make the world of difference, and not just proving that this is the word of God, but rather that even if Israel's not the first to have a creation story, that they have a unique contribution to their culture and what they're trying to say about God. And so that's why it's important for us to know what are some of the different things going on within the stories, because again, that if we don't know what else is out there, then we can't identify some of the differences that are there. Again, it's a lot like knowing not just our own family histories, but the histories of our countries, the histories of our cities, the histories of our peoples. That if we're without a story, then you can kind of just make up whatever you want. And yeah, it might be different, but it's a lot harder to identify the beautiful differences that might be had if we don't really know our own stories. And so that's why. And again, especially when we get into Genesis 1 and 2, and I'll talk about it specifically, some of the differences, then hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer about like, oh, that's why. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, you guys go ahead. Take a. Do you want to get back here? 17-minute break. It's random, but just be back at 3. So be back at 3. It's 17 minutes. That's a good amount of time. So, all right. You guys get something to drink. Take a break. Take a nap. Let me go ahead and open this up for you guys to take a look. Here we go. All right. There we go. So, having already taken our break here, we're going to go ahead and continue on with our lecture for this afternoon. All right. So let me go ahead and begin the second half with reading through Genesis 1 through 3, which you'll have read for this class. So you guys are already knowing, well aware, but I did want to jot our memories once again as we continue on with Genesis. So in the beginning, when God, or Elohim in Hebrew, created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. Notice that it doesn't say nothing, that nothing was there. There was just a giant black hole, and God was just sitting around with a pile on his hands and just wondering what to do. So there's a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God, a breath from God, swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So there's a few things that I do want us to take note of, and I kind of italicize them so you guys can kind of see. There's a couple of elements here. One of them is this assumption that when we get to Genesis 1, that there is, again, and Estella, this is why I bring up some of the things that why we need to know stories from different cultures, is that what are some of the elements, and I brought them up before, but what are some of the elements that are involved with other cultures in terms of their beginnings, their stories of how the earth came to be? What are some of the elements that are usually common for other stories? And I had brought it up about 30 or so minutes ago. What happened?
Fighting between gods,
yep.
deities.
Yep, fighting amongst the gods. That's definitely prevalent. I believe it's in Numa Elish where you have Marduk, who's going to then plunge a knife into Tiamat or kill Tiamat, and then that's going to become the waters. Marduk will set himself up as the supreme deity. I believe that's in Numa Elish. And in other, again, you have violence that's prevalent in other stories, but here, not so much. What are some other elements that are common? And don't be afraid to say it. We're all adults here. But you have in other stories that there's procreative activities that give birth to other gods. Sex. Sperm one, yep. Where the juices, I hate saying that, but the fluids of deities then make for creative elements within the habitat or within the universe. And so both in terms of sex amongst the deities and what their fluids turn into and become, again, you don't have any of that. And so again, another big one is magic. That there's no harnessing of some kind of outside divine power in order to enact one's will. Greek gods, exactly. And definitely the presence of other deities, that there's nobody there, just him. Just God, here in the beginning. And so that's why, again, knowing what's the difference between some of these stories, because we can very easily get caught in thinking, especially at the front end of these things, that if the Bible's not the only book, then how do we know this one is the right one? One is the consistency in the narrative, and the concern for being right is often something that I think we get too caught up in. But the other one is that there's not things being imported into the narrative just kind of wholesale. That is just kind of a willy-nilly, we need to make something up, so we just need to throw something out there to compete with the rest of these nations. No, that they have some elements in common, but these differences are making a pointed assertion about who God is and the essence of his character, and how God is essentially different from these not only deities, but also these humans, because that'll come up in the narrative as well. So Genesis 1, that introduction, that in the beginning, that you have that formless and void that equates to being without order, that God has not yet ordered creation. So Genesis 1 becomes a story about how God then orders the cosmos or the universe. And at the beginning, God's name, Elohim, this kind of general name for God at Genesis 1, sets about some distance between himself and creation. Because again, in Genesis 1, that's why italicizes it, how does God create? How does God create in Genesis 1?
With his words?
Words, speaking. Just talks. There it goes. And it is. And so again, how God goes about establishing order in Genesis 1 will then get elaborated in the following sentences. But again, you see here how God is going to start from the outside, the heavens kind of up here, and then the earth down here. And then what's going to start happening as we see the story is that then the pieces, these kind of two elements, are going to start to get filled in. So wonderfully demonstrated in this sweet little outline I have color-coded, created for yourselves, for those of you that love organization. So you can see here, that first day, the first unit, if we go about reading just straight through, we might miss these kinds of things, because what you see between the first and the fourth day is a relationship where God creates light, On the fourth day, he creates things that bear light, like the sun and the moon and the stars that carry light with themselves. On the second day, the fifth day, you see the relationship between the sky and the sea, and the sky and the sea creatures. And then the third day, I'll go ahead and finish. The third day, he creates the land, and the sixth day, he creates the land creatures and includes the humans. That first, what you see in these first 3 days of God creating the kind of structure, the form, that then he will begin to fill in between the light bearers, the sky and sea creatures, and the land creatures. That again, he builds the habitat and then puts the creatures that live within the habitat after. And so again, those of you that have ever worked in construction or have done side jobs or projects, you'll know that if you don't have a solid foundation to build on, it will make the work very, very, very difficult. If your math is even a little bit off, you might be able to get by, especially if your math's way off, then it's gonna be a mess. That usually when you're building something, you build the frame first and you ensure that it's solid, and then you start filling it in. It would make no sense to put furniture on a big old pile of dirt without having first laid down some cement, built the frames for the walls, provided the structure and supports necessary for life to commence. And that's essentially what God does with the first 3 days. He builds the habitat and then starts filling it in. And you will notice that the humans in Genesis 1 here amongst the land creatures. And you also notice that seventh day ain't like the rest. That seventh day ain't like the rest. And that there's a couple things going on. One of them is that the importance of 7 in terms of communicating completion, finality. But then also the kind of setting apart of this day where God rests. And it's important to remember this because especially as we get to Genesis or Exodus, the reason why the Israelites will Sabbath is because God took a break from creating. And it's not as if it's either or, and especially we'll talk about in Deuteronomy, it'll become about Exodus, but that even God takes a break from working. And that again, you'll notice amongst here that there's a definitive difference between God and other deities, whereas in other creation stories, humans are created to serve and be slaves to the gods. And in this story, you have the God who takes a day off and allows and commands humans to take a break, take a day off, get up out of here, go home. And so I won't get too far into the weeds with this one, especially if you're taking discipleship. You'll talk about it with Sabbath, but that this God's different. He doesn't perpetually demand servitude and harsh labor, but rather he even gives a day off. He takes a day off. And so we'll talk about some of the implications of that when we get there. But again, here it's important to notice that at this event, and I bring it up in Bib Lit, but to bring it up again, that there's something going on with that seventh day. And I'll talk about it when we get there. But before we get to there, let's go ahead and read through Genesis 1:26 through 28. Does somebody want to read this? I don't want to be talking the whole time again like I did last time. So somebody want to read this?
I can read it.
Do it.
And God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth.
Thank you. Excellent. Wonderfully, wonderfully worded. All right. So we're going to see a few things going on here. One of them, this kind of creation of humankind in our image, that this kind of conversation. I don't want us to get bogged down here. It happened in the Tuesday, Thursday class, but what are you going to do? But there's something going on here between being made in God's image and then what happens here with being fruitful, multiplying, have dominion upon the sea, and those kinds of things. And we're going to make those connections right now. But Adam in Genesis 1, that this humankind, this is let us make Adam in our image, not like a Dominic, but Adam, what we'd say Adam in our image. It's humankind, male and female. It doesn't just refer to males. And thankfully, this is why I have you guys use NRSV, because other translations will say, let us make man in our image. And oftentimes that can be put as, let us make males in our image. And males assume the responsibility of bearing the image of God, while females have a kind of subservience to that role or that responsibility that is only males. But that's a distortion of what's going on in Hebrew. Because again, it's in reference to humankind, male and female. And that this being made in the image of God, that this image, and some of you will know this, but some of you this will be a reminder, but some of you this might be new, that this word image in Hebrew comes from a context of idols, that it's used in other places for idols or images. And what an idol did is that it stood in place of as a representative of the deity it was meant to represent. And so again, that the idol stood in place of the deity as a representative, as a reminder of this deity. And oftentimes what you would have is that you would have a temple being built to, let's say there was a temple built to Artemis. And what you do is that you would construct a small little idol to kind of stand in its place in order to say that, hey, Artemis is now here in this place. And you would place it within the middle. But what God does is that he creates, if we can put it this way, he creates these little idols, these little representatives of himself within the middle of what we can call a garden, or what creation is being built as, which is a temple. That these representatives between these, the male and the female together are meant to represent God's image. And you see the interrelatedness between the humans, that we have the male and the female, the ish in Hebrew and the isha, the woman, demonstrates this relatedness, that one name is taken from the other. And the responsibility that they have to steward, to care for all of creation. And I'll rehash some things in Biblit, but it's important for us here to, again, either to rehash or to recognize anew that there's a fundamental connection with us being made in God's image, to be representative of God's on the earth, and our responsibility to steward and to care for all of creation, including the earth and animals, and then later on, as we'll come to find out in Genesis 4, one another. That we have a responsibility to care for all of creation, including one another. And then fulfilling this responsibility, that's how we fulfill our calling to be representatives of God on the earth, when we live into this image-bearing creature. And again, it looks a whole lot like love the Lord your God as with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, if you want to think of it that way. That's how we fulfill our obligations to be representatives of God on the earth. Are there any questions about that? I know, again, a lot of questions come up here. Any questions? Again, we can't think of dominion in terms of domination or in terms of complete control and subservience, because we're going to miss it if we do that. We miss the responsibility element, which is that's what's being more communicated more so than control. We've seen what happens when humans try to control and dominate the earth, and it's not going well. It's really not going well. So are there any questions in relationship to this? Representative responsibility. And again, what we're going to start to see is how the humans go about doing this. First with Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. So again, when we get to talking about Genesis 3, keep this in mind. Keep this in mind, responsibility and representation. Responsibility and representation. Responsibility to steward, care for creation. Again, having the responsibility doesn't necessarily give them the license to dominate, but rather to provide care for, to be responsible for. Any questions, comments, concerns? And just as a side note, because there may be some that have questions, just don't want to distract. This let us make mankind, humankind in our image, to make humankind in our image is kind of plural there. If you have questions about it, talk to me afterwards. There is a bit of explaining that it'll just take us down a rabbit trail that we really don't have time for. So yeah, if you do have questions about that, we can talk about it afterwards. But God's work ending in rest, or the Sabbath. And I had mentioned before that there's something going on with this last day that is significantly different than what's going on with the rest of the days. And what's being communicated here at the end is that at the end of God building his temple is that the king is taking a seat on his throne overlooking all of creation. That Yahweh is taking a look over his temple, the place where he is now present with his little idols, with his representatives, the humans, united in a garden. Hence, a little garden in the background. Immersive experience is what we're all about here. All right, let me see. There's a question here. Isn't that the Trinity? We can talk about it afterwards. It could be, but it's not the only possibility, Jasper. So. But right here from Genesis 1, where is God in relationship to creation? Where is God? Is God separate from creation? Or is he created and bound by it? Is he just, he's one amongst the many? And as you guys know from you guys' reading ancient Near Eastern cultures, that a lot of the deities, they were bound by certain limitations that they had. In other words, is God transcendent? Or is God immanent? He's just in and amongst and hanging around.
Can you explain it a little bit more when you mean like transcendent?
Transcendent is it which one is not like the others? Is God very much like the other created creatures, or is he something other than? Is he something different? Is he somebody different than what is coming out, what is around, specifically in terms of creation and what's being created? Because again, like you guys know from you guys' reading, is that there's other deities that they're bound by certain limitations. Does this God seem to have limitations?
No.
Good. Good, that he's transcendent. And this transcendence is what we call the essence of holiness. This dude's different. He's different. And again, that's the essence of holiness. It's not moral superiority as much as it is difference in the midst of. Difference in the midst of. And what is being demonstrated here in Genesis 1, again, that in the context of all these other ancient Near Eastern stories where these gods are not only subject to one another, they're also subject to outside forces, but that this God, he creates by talking. He doesn't need to whip up some magic concoction in order to be able to have his will be done. He just needs to talk. That he's alone. That there's nobody that's comparing to him, and that there's no contest between him and some kind of rival deity in order to have his will accomplished. This dude's different. And so again, and that's what we mean by the essence of holiness. And this is going to come up again. Tell the guys how we build different, bro. This will come up again, especially in Exodus, because you will have this proclamation by Moses that you are majestic in holiness, that amongst the gods, there's no one like you. And that's, again, what is attempting to be communicated, and why knowing the different stories amongst the ancient Near Eastern cultures proves to be so important, because what is being communicated by these cultures. And again, if we were to take that this is being written post-exile, after having experienced the tragedy, the trauma of experiencing the horrors of being kicked out of your homeland, experiencing death, being in a foreign land where there seems like there's no hope, and yet to understand how these stories being reminded to you about the God who created in the beginning is a God who can create anew, seemingly not just out of nothing, but out of the disorder, he can create order. And out of what seems like nothing, God can create not only something, but something different, because he's different. And so again, that to be able to understand about how much these stories aren't just meant for them to have information about who God is, but to help them to understand not only God's nature and character as he does things, but who he is in relationship to his people. And that again, the same God who creates is the same God who liberates. And as we'll see later on, he just liberates in a different way, in a different kind of way. And so in Genesis 2, you have God walking around in this garden. I should have it here, but I do not. Let me go ahead and pull this up for you guys to take a look at, because we need to see this for ourselves. I'm never just about just believe me, and then we'll keep it moving. Okay. Let me. All right. So this is Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, that in the day that the Lord God, already got a different name, and the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Notice it doesn't say heavens and the earth, and that's important. When no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, but the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground. This is going to be Ish. That God formed Ish from the dust of the ground, the man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Notice how God's creating here. God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, tree of life also in the midst of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river flows out of Eden to the water of the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches, and we're going to find out about some rivers that are there. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, you may eat freely of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. From the day you eat of it, you shall die. So there's a few things going on there that we do need to talk about here. And so God is present with the man in the garden, and they start up a conversation. But again, at the start of it, you have the Lord God being introduced. And again, the significant difference between the two, it's not just God generally, but that Yahweh, God's name in the Old Testament as revealed to Moses, Yahweh who is Elohim, or Yahweh Elohim, God's personal name. And I'll talk about the importance of that when we get to Exodus. But again, you already have this personal element in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And then you have this creation of this human, Adam, to till or to work the garden in partnership with God. Again, this responsibility to work the ground, and that you have this man named Adam who works the ground, in Hebrew, the Adamah. That this relationship between the man and the earth that he works, that there's a relationship that the man, that us as humans have with the land that we've been taken from, and that Eden becomes this kind of planted home for the humans, these early humans. That the first job, the first vocation, if you will, is as a gardener, as Adam works the ground, bringing up cabbage and strawberries and I don't know what else, zucchini. That's always good. And what we find here in the middle of the story are these trees that are the center of life. And you'll notice within the Old Testament, trees, anything important happens, there's a tree around. Heads up, trees are important in the New Testament too, as we'll find somebody hanging from one. But you'll notice that trees will factor prominently within narratives, and it factors prominently here and in Genesis 3. Old Pentateuch is an earthy book. Old Testament's an earthy book. Bible's an earthy book as a whole, but especially the Old Testament. And that's the beauty of it. So let me get back to Genesis 2 here. Starting at verse 18, that then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." Notice that there, that it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man, there was not found a helper as his partner. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed it up in its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman. And he made isn't necessarily strong enough. Is probably best put. He had taken from the man, he built into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and mother." You can have a little bit of interpretation about marriage, and clings to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So God goes and he walks Eve right down the aisle. Well, really what he does, he builds her, but brings her down the aisle, presents him to the man. But you'll notice the description for the woman is what God takes note of isn't Adam's loneliness. It's Adam's aloneness. That being alone, isolated is the issue, not loneliness. That being isolated alone is not the issue. It's that it's not loneliness, it's isolation that is the issue. And again, it's not to say that it's bad to be by yourself, because Jesus often goes away to be alone in order to pray. But kind of solitary confinement, isolation, that becomes the issue. That it would fair to say that us as humans are created to be communal creatures, and that it's rather inhumane to subjugate someone to isolation or to isolate yourself. To cut yourself off from human interaction and community, places to receive love and care and grace and all these gifts that God so desires to give us. But again, it's God that notices. It wasn't Adam reaching out, saying, "Man, this sucks. This season of singleness sucks. Time for it to end. God, bring me my I don't know who in the world would bring this up, but I don't know. Bring me my Sarah, bring me my Eve, or bring whatever partner you want to bring up from the Old Testament or the New Testament. Looking for his better half. It's God that takes notice. So what does God do? While he forms the man, he builds the woman. And again, this is really important, especially because some of us may be at churches or have been in churches where women are often seen as second-class citizens because of order of creation, but that doesn't necessarily make sense because humans are created after the man. So it wouldn't make sense that animals would be that when it's the opposite, but that there's a special description, a special place created for the woman, and that God, again, builds the woman from the man, which again shows this kind of interconnection between males and females and between humanity. That both males and females have these earthy beginnings. And that Adam's proclamation that this one finally, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, this indication of passion and relationship. Of course, this is in the context of marriage, but even within, to pull away a little bit from that to get a bigger view that, especially now, pandemic notwithstanding, outside of that, it's difficult to, especially within church, to form honest friendships between males and females without sexualization of the relationship specifically. And it's not to say that we shouldn't have wisdom, but at the same time, what seems to have guided us more so, at least within the past 20, 30, 40 years, more so is our orientation as sexual beings without thought to the relationships that we have in terms of church, of being brothers and sisters. And so again, I don't want to just simply be like, well, we should all be able to do whatever we want. No, that's not the case at all. But can we at least go back to restoring some of the relationship and not hypersexualizing every single male-female relationship that can help to empower kingdom work? I think so. Can we go back to honoring the roles of friendship, not just as this kind of second-class relationship until we finally find the one, but as a means of being able to communicate love and care for one another that isn't just sexualized? I hope so. I hope so. Because again, the one relationship we're all going to share, married couples included, is one as brothers and sisters. That's one of the few things we get to take with us from here into eternity as God's family, is our relationships as brothers and sisters. And so we need community. We need community, and especially in a time like right now, man. Dude, I was talking to my friend, it was just yesterday. And it's been pretty rough since the start of the year. I don't know what's going on with me. Feeling a little funky. I don't know if anybody's feeling funk too, but man, talking to my buddy was like a breath of fresh air. I hadn't seen him in like almost a year. But it was like, man, like you don't realize how much you lose until you kind of don't have that same connection again. And it's fair to say that a lot of us, and especially during the pandemic, that the one thing is, it don't matter if you're introvert or extrovert at this point. It matters that you're human, and that as a human, you need this connection with other individuals. And that especially as a church, that to see this Eden as a home with relationships without shame, that first initial home, that the man and the woman are there naked and unashamed, that to be in relationships without a hint of, I need to cover this up. If they only knew this thing about me, if they only knew who I really was or what I really did, if I could just make myself this one thing, and then I'd be able to be acceptable. And how much we need to work towards this, because again, that's the original vision between males and females, and us with one another. Again, that this original home without shame, without having to feel the obligation to have to cover up. Because again, after the humans have their eyes open, what's the first thing they do? Don't look at me. Cover up. And so, are there any questions before we jump into groups here for a minute? Any questions? Any questions? All right. Well, let me go ahead and do this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to make this on 1, and so you guys can see this 1, 2, and 3. What I'm going to do is I'm going to assign you guys to groups right now in a minute. But what I want you guys to do, if you haven't taken a picture yet, please do so or take note. I'm going to send this out, but so you guys can take a look. I'm going to still go ahead and set you guys into groups, and I'll give you guys a few minutes to look at the text and then answer the questions as we begin to work through them. Let me go ahead and put this up so you guys can see it again. So again, you guys can see a number. Genesis 3 is number 1, Genesis 4 is number 2, and then Genesis 6 is number 3. And so again, I'm going to send you guys into breakout rooms here, and then I'll give you guys a number, and then we'll kind of work through it. And so again, if you don't have your cameras on, just let your group, people in your group know, hey, I'm here. And then begin to work through the questions.
Group theme song.
Yeah. So you guys are group number 1. Genesis 3, it's often called the fall of man or the fall of humanity. But this is a little bit of a misnomer because they don't fall from one place to another as if they no longer have relationship with God. Yes, it is, there's a kind of distortion within the relationship, but it's not as if Adam and Eve were no longer God's people and God picked up somebody else and decided, you know what, I'm going to give up on you guys. You guys are done. Call in James and Jane. Let's get them in here. Start all over. No. But again, God goes with the humans, but there's a kind of loss or a separation, a change in the relationship between God and humanity, or God and these first humans. And that you have this originating sin that leads to a kind of rebellion or disobedience. I like to call it rebellion. Again, for us, again, it highlights the relational aspect of it. Again, you have these two humans that are under the king, which is God, and that what they do is they subvert what his command is, but that subservient comes by way of this kind of instigator that's the snake. And we're not sure, again, whether it's Satan, the devil, or some kind of embodiment of evil, but what we do know is that there's some kind of opposition that is present within this early narrative, and that this opposition is bent, again, on tempting these humans towards rebellion. But what that rebellion looks like, and I should be going over it here in a minute, ultimately is what we call autonomy. 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 Self-rule. And the relationship between being like God and knowing good and evil is essentially being able to call the shots yourself, that we are the ones, that Adam and Eve are the ones that get to say what is good and what is evil. That there's this intimate, intricate connection between this decision that they get to make, that this is good for me, this is not good for me, outside of God's wisdom, outside of God's ordering of for creatures. The humans are the one that get to make that designation for themselves, to themselves, by themselves. And again, you'll see that come up again in somewhere like Isaiah, where they have called good evil and what is evil good. And this kind of self-rule, this autonomy for oneself ends up leading humanity into more and more trouble. And that God knows leads to this human action, that God knows that you're not going to die. And there's some interpretation that in that day that you will surely die, and some have taken that muth to muth, that it's both a spiritual and a physical death. That's not the implication. The implication of the you will die is that you will absolutely, positively, without a shadow of a doubt, die. No separation between spirit and body, or you only do one or the other. But that without a shadow of a doubt, you're gone. You're a goner. And this isn't to nullify what God said, but rather to demonstrate God's character and this demonstration of his grace and mercy as the default. But there is a kind of death that is symbolized by the change in the relationship between God and humanity, and now how striving and a kind of culture of death will become prominent in the relationship between God and creatures, specifically humans. And that again, usually a lot of the blame is put onto Eve, but this again, it's not necessarily the right way to go about doing things. So now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we. And so again, oftentimes it's interpreted as a singular, but anybody from the South or from Texas, did God, it's better translated y'all. Y'all shall not eat from the fruit. Y'all shall not die. For God knows that when y'all eat of it, y'all will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so again, that it's best put in the plural, but again, it's not just Eve that is being spoken to, but rather it's both Adam and Eve together. And what this demonstrates more so, because again, usually they take it because Paul puts the blame on Eve, that it's the fault of the foolishness of the woman, rather than the failure of the man to pass along the commandment that he was given by God at the beginning of chapter 2, which is not to eat of that fruit. So it's likely the responsibility of the male, which is why it comes down upon him and upon them both. And so again, that Eve isn't alone. They're both there silent, but Adam's there silent, knowing that we should not eat from the tree, but yet stands there as a bystander, not saying a word. And so this initiates what then becomes disorder, that disobedience, rebellion invites disorder. And that's exactly what we see happen in chapter 6. We see creation unraveling from the seams. And so I'll come back to this question because we do need to get through a couple things, because again, we're a little bit behind. But in Genesis chapter 4, that you have a story that begins positively. A couple brothers out there making their sacrifices, doing their thing. We're not sure where the wives come from, but they're there. Happy young married men. But what you have there is that you have these two brothers that are making an offering, and that you have between the two of what's being offered by Cain and what's being offered by Abel, that Abel gives the firstborn, but what Cain gives is the fat. And the implication of this is that Abel gives the best to God, while Cain just gives an offering. But there's something that's being offered that's different between the two. One of them, Abel gives the best of what he's got. Cain gives just something of what he's got. And the possibility that is available for Cain to participate in the same kind of activities as Abel to offer his best is available to Cain. He just refuses to do so. And so what Cain does is that God, who makes it clear to Cain that he can master his sin, but he chooses to kill. There's a possibility available to Cain to make another decision, to have a way out, but yet he gives in to the temptation to kill, whether it be because of jealousy, resentment. We don't know. But what we do know is that Cain bears the responsibility for his actions. There's no "the devil made me do it" here. But Cain is responsible for his activities and his actions. And that you have sin rearing its face, that it's enticing, it's possessive. It's what we call anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphic. The word anthropo or anthropos coming from the word human, morphic meaning to change, that it takes on human characteristics. It's a kind of force, this nebulous force that is demanding. But what sin begins to do is starts affecting the most basic of relationships, which is familial relationships. We saw it happen to Adam and Eve, and even between Adam and Eve, and now we see it happen between brothers, between family members. Sin is now seeping down into family relationships. And anybody that's spent 15 minutes on earth will recognize that. That again, sin is starting to work its way down. What we're going to see in chapter 6 is that sin starts working its way out. That we see Eden, places wrecked, trashed. Yahweh's world has now turned against him, that he feels a certain way about the way creation has gone because it's now infected itself with violence. And mind you, this is the first word that comes up. It comes up again with Genesis chapter 4, but it'll come up again in 6, that the earth is filled with violence. What is it about violence that has to be named? And I would fair to say that, at least it's my assertion, this isn't any kind of scholar speaking, again, just from what I've posited, that not only violence as a dehumanizing effort, but ultimately disrupting what God is attempting to put back into order. And that violence both dehumanizes and throws into chaos that which God is ordering and is restoring. And having lived in a violent home for a good chunk of my childhood, that's exactly what happens. And now the temptation of what trauma does to us as individuals, which is to participate in dehumanizing one another. And that happens in a plethora of ways. Whether it be through addictions, whether it be through sexual abuse and trafficking, whether it be through child labor, and war and violence. So this is still something we're dealing with. But what happens as a part of God's response, and not just ceasing to participate with humanity, but that literally Yahweh is brokenhearted. When I say Yahweh is grieved to the heart, is that his heart breaks. The Yahweh is personally affected by what his creatures do. The Yahweh is sorry that he's brokenhearted. He's rethinking what in the world will happen. The Yahweh has concerns about what
Did you call me prisoner?
All right, Tarzan. The Yahweh has concern about what happens on earth and when injustice and evil prevails. There's a real concern that breaks God's heart. So break my heart for what breaks yours? Well, guess what? The injustice will do it. We don't need to generalize it. We'll make it specific. And again, in the various ways in which injustice shows its face. And so we'll end here with the minute that we got left. So sin and its consequences. We made it, baby. We made it. Sin is disobedience or rebellion. And we'll talk about this in Leviticus. We'll add some more layers to it. But if there's one thing we walk away with sin as disobedience or rebellion, and how disobedience and rebellion invites chaos back into created order. How disobedience or rebellion invites chaos back into created order. And so what we'll start to see next week, talking about the flood, and we'll talk about Abraham, is how God will then begin to restore order back into creation by way of choosing individuals in order to reenact order in with creation. And how God will continue to participate and strive with humanity in order to bring about what was the original intent, which is God being together with humanity. And so again, sin changes three things as we wrap up here: that relationships with God, relationships between human beings, and relationships with the rest of creation nature, namely the land. And I cannot overstate this last one, because so much of what will end up causing issues is not just humans' relationship with the land, but God giving the people a land. And that again, it's important to have a place. Again, when you have a migrant community, to have a place for them to live, for them to dwell, for them to raise their kids, for them to have their cattle to roam, for them to have their goats, to have some grass to chew on, that God's concerned about these things and he will provide a place for them. But sin manages to worm its way in there. And how in Exodus, and then especially in Leviticus, how God will provide a means to address this here, the thing that gets in the way. And so I know we're a little bit over on time, but are there any questions? I'm pumped because we're on track. We're finally back on track. I stayed up. I stay up at night, anxious, wondering if we're ever going to get back on track, but we did it. We did it. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, regrets? This is like Eden. Be unashamed.
I'm gonna just wait till after.
Okay. All right. Well, if there are no somebody have a question? I don't want to step on nobody's toes if you guys still have a question. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, you guys have an absolutely awesome Monday. It's Super Bowl week. I don't know if you guys are into football or not, but some of you are into football and more football, but enjoy it. I think the Lakers are playing right now, so that's always good. Coming back off some losses, but we'll be all right. All right. You guys have an excellent Monday.
Thank you.
Sir.
See you guys.